Great. Well, hello, welcome. It's really an immense pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Seyfarth. Robert got his undergraduate degree at Harvard back in 1970 in bioanthro, and then he went to the University of Cambridge for his graduate training. He spent a few years at Rockefeller as a postdoc and then assistant professor. And then after a gig at UCLA for a few years, he was hired for good at UPenn, where he's been ever since and is now emeritus there. So Robert has been influential across numerous fields. So he's an animal behavioral researcher, as most of you know, and he worked with a few different primate species over his career, but his influence, I think, has extended impressively way beyond the field of animal behavior and has had really profound implications for understanding the evolution of our own species, including critically our social abilities and our linguistic communicative abilities. Robert has received numerous awards. Since 2012, he's been a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and since 2017, a member of the National Academy. And many of you probably, well, maybe except for the real young ones, know the seminal paper that Robert published with Dorothy Cheney and others in 1980, showing that vervet monkeys have different calls for different predators. In other words, they use word-like signals where different kinds of vocalizations are associated with different meanings. And of course, since then, he has done a lot of really beautiful foundational work, including in more recent years on really cool topics like where friendships come from in primates. How does that happen and why? Robert's work has also had a very profound impact on my own work on thinking about where the language system may have come from and what it might be for. And so it's a real pleasure to have Robert tell us about his work.
Thanks very much for inviting me. In 1838, Charles Darwin, this was 20 years before he would publish The Origins of Species, began to realize that his theory of evolution by natural selection, which was originally designed to explain the evolution of morphological structures like the beak of a finch, could also use to explain the evolution of how organisms think, their cognitive abilities. He said in his M notebook, M for metaphysics, we can just trace causation of thought. It obeys the same laws as other parts of structures. And a few pages later, he uttered one of his more quotable remarks, the origin of man is now proved, metaphysics must flourish. He who understands the baboon would do more toward metaphysics than Locke. When we try to take up Darwin's challenge and use research on baboons to understand the origin and evolution of human thinking, we immediately come up against a problem. Humans have language and baboons don't. And because language and thinking are so intimately involved, it makes it very difficult to draw a distinction, a developmental distinction between humans and human language and non-human primates. The differences between human language and baboon communication and communication of other non-human primates are pretty clear. I don't need to explain them to this audience, but there are really fundamental differences that I don't want to minimize. And because the systems of communication are so different, it's led a lot of people, including experts like Steve Pinker, to say, well, it's just a mystery how it all happened. What I would like to do today is take a slightly different perspective and look, rather than on language per se, on the way non-human primates think and communicate with each other. And I want to ask some fairly basic questions about, in this case, baboons. So we take it as given that human thought and language are inextricably linked and have evolved together. Although non-human primates lack language, the same holds for them. Their communication, whatever it's like, is also linked to how they think. So we can start asking questions like, how does meaning arise without words? How are knowledge and meaning represented in a mind without language? And really, a much more basic question, what do non-human primates communicate and think about? And so that's the starting point for what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to begin by briefly reviewing something that all of you know much more about than I do. There are, in human and non-human primates, many homologous mechanisms for perception and cognition, particularly having to do with perception and cognition of members of your own species. We have homologous areas for face recognition, homologous brain areas for voice recognition, for cross-modal integration of voices and faces, for gaze following, for joint attention and identity recognition, homologous areas for the recognition of call meaning, and for object recognition. Now, these many homologous neural mechanisms are unlikely to have arisen just by chance. Instead, they suggest that during the long shared evolutionary history of human and non-human primates, these different species confronted similar sorts of problems, and they evolved similar neural mechanisms to deal with them. So the question is, what were these problems? And what similarities can we find between the way non-human primates use vocalizations and the way humans use language? The work that I'm going to be talking about is work that Dorothy Cheney and I did for 16 years in Botswana in southern Africa. Botswana is the sort of area in the middle. For much of the year, Botswana, the Okavango Delta in northwest Botswana is a spectacular attraction, amazing wildlife animals and typical savanna woodland activities. And the baboons range around. They're terrestrial primates. They raise around. They're surrounded by other individuals and predators and so on. And they live in large social groups that I'll talk about in more detail. For another part of the year, floodwaters come down from Angola and flood the Okavango Delta up to a depth of sort of mid-calf level. And at this point, the baboons move through the water from one area to another, going from one island to another. And if you go to the David Attenborough series Planet Earth and you look at the chapter on savannas, you can see actually our baboons being filmed crossing through the water in their various interesting ways. The baboons live in groups of about 60 to 80. We would go out every morning and follow them every day. We recognize all the individuals as individuals. This takes a long time to learn, but you can do it. And we follow them as they go about their business, and we take data on individuals and their social behavior. And we do this by picking one individual, following it in detail, taking detailed data on who it does, with whom, then pick another individual, and so on and so forth. And we, with our postdocs, did this continuously every day for about 16 years. So we're fairly used to these animals, and we recognize them pretty well. Let me give you a bit about the social background, because that's going to become crucial to how we interpret and understand their communication. Baboons live in large social groups, 60, 80, even 100 individuals. There are many more females than males, and as a male baboon grows up in the group, he stays close to his mother for about the first 5 years, and then he leaves the group where he was born and goes to join another group. And he may transfer from one group to another once during his lifetime, or he may do it 3 or 4 times during his lifetime. The females, on the other hand, remain in their group throughout their lives, and they remain closely bonded to their mothers and their matrilineal sisters. And by closely bonded, I mean they groom a lot, They tolerate each other at feeding areas, they forage together, they form alliances together. And if you came out with us and you'd learn to recognize all the individuals and observe them systematically, you'd come back and say, well, there's actually one female who, when she walks through the group, other animals sort of step aside. She's not aggressive, they just defer to her. And that is the highest ranking female in the highest ranking family. And if you continued your observation, you would find that that female's daughters acquire dominance ranks immediately below those of their mothers. And this is true for all the matrilineal families down the line. So what you're looking at when you're looking at a group of baboons is a bunch of males who've come in from elsewhere. They stay for a while and then they leave. And also a core group of matrilineal families where the females have known each other and interact with each other throughout their lives, so that it goes from the highest ranking female in the highest ranking family down to the lowest ranking female in the lowest ranking family. In this kind of social environment, the relationships are simultaneously both cooperative and competitive. You keep in good touch with your relatives and form alliances with them, with your matrilineal kin, but you also try to establish bonds, ideally, with the members of the highest ranking families. And there's a lot of alliance, a lot of jockeying, but what's amazing about these matrilineal hierarchies is that they're incredibly stable over years. In addition to our long-term study, there is an even longer-term study run by scientists at Duke and Princeton, and we know from these works that the matrilineal rank orders just don't change very often. Occasionally, there's a challenge by the members of a lower-ranking family to the members of a higher-ranking family, but it rarely succeeds. So we can be fairly confident that when we look at the high-ranking matrilines in the family that we're studying, we're looking at the descendants of high-ranking matrilines that go back into the 19th century or even before. I should say also that there's what biologists call low reproductive skew among the females. That is, most all of the females have offspring, and they don't differ tremendously, though they do differ measurably in their reproductive success. Okay, vocalizations. If you came out and you watched the baboons with us, the first thing you'd notice is, what is all this grunting? They grunt to each other all the time, and they grunt in various sorts of interactions. And what I wanted to give you an idea is what these grunts sound like. So here are 6 of our females, and for each of the females, I've put a little sonogram of 2 of their grunts, and then I will play this to you if I can get this to work. So you can see there are real differences from the females, but they're obviously all grunts. And the baboons have a number of other vocalizations that they give to each other. The grunts you've already heard, but they also give screams. They give fear barks, and screams, grunts, I should say, you can give a grunt to anybody, higher ranking animal, lower ranking animal, whatever. We'll talk more about that. Screams are only given by lower ranking animals to higher ranking animals. The same holds for fear barks. Threat grunts, on the other hand, are only given by higher ranking animals to lower ranking animals. So right away, baboons present us with a dilemma. They have, certainly compared to humans, a very small repertoire of vocal signals, and yet they live in an extremely complicated society in which there are a variety of different kinds of relationships, and in which these vocalizations are used, as you'll see, to modify and control and establish and maintain close social bonds with individuals. So how do they make a simple vocal repertoire work in a highly complex society? Well, let's take the grunts, for example. The grunts are given in many different circumstances, on many different contexts. why do baboons grunt? What's going on with this, and what does a grunt mean to the other individual that hears it? Well, in some respects, the answer is easy. Baboon females are really attracted to tiny babies, especially just after they're born. And very often, baboons will go up to a mother with a new baby and try and touch and handle the baby and groom the mother. Mothers are a little bit nervous about this, and sometimes they're particularly nervous if it's a high-ranking female coming to touch their baby, and they may avoid the area, or they may turn their back, and in response, the females who approach a mother with an infant often give a grunt. And this grunt seems to have a major effect on what happens afterwards. So, for example, if you look at the probability of friendly behavior, which is on the y-axis here on the top graph, if there's a call, meaning a grunt, or no call, you can see that friendly behavior is much more likely if the approaching female grunts, whereas a supplant, where the mother moves off and they don't interact, it's much less likely in this case. But how do the grunts achieve this effect? How does it work? Is it simply that a grunt, any old grunt, is reassuring and calming, or is there something more interesting about the grunt? Does the grunt, for example, signal the vocalizer's intended behavior? Well, Joan Silk tested this hypothesis with rhesus macaques that also give grunts and what are called gurney vocalizations when they try to interact with infants. And they found that, in fact, if there was a grunt, the probability of aggression was very low, the probability of friendly behavior was very high. So, in other words, there was a predictable, contingent relationship between a female's giving a grunt and what her intentions are, what she is likely to do. And no doubt mothers have recognized this contingency, and so when they hear a grunt, they relax. When they don't hear a grunt, they get a little bit nervous. So that's one explanation for why baboons grunt and what the grunts mean to others, but it turns out to be a lot more complicated than this. If you take away the grunts that were given to infants, it turns out that some females grunt more to high-ranking individuals, where there are other females who grunt more to low-ranking individuals. It's as if some individuals use grunts to curry favor, and others use grunts to just be nice to other individuals. Some females are often alone, and the other animals avoid them and don't grunt very often. Ironically, mothers and daughters, the individuals that have the closest bonds and that interact most often, they don't grunt very much at all. It's as if they don't need the grunt in their interaction. And finally, a really interesting recent study showed that females who experience more early life adversity, like harsh ecological conditions, more competition, a sibling close in age, a mother's death, they're less likely to receive grunts from others and less likely to grunt to other individuals. So the whole business of grunting is very complex and depends on the circumstances surrounding these two individuals. There's another, even more interesting phenomenon, one that you could anthropomorphically call reconciliation. We first noticed this in baboons, where we would see one individual act aggressively to another, the other individual would scream or move away, and just as they were about to separate, the original antagonist would turn to the other female and give a grunt. Ugh. And the effect was amazing. The other female would relax, her ears would go back, she would just sort of sit down, and they were much more likely to interact with each other. It seemed like a reconciliatory signal. But we wanted to test this with an experiment, so here's the experiment that we did. And in this case, I'm going to use letters to denote families in rank order, A downwards, and numbers to denote the individuals within families. So we're walking along, and we follow these baboons, and we wait until a higher-ranking animal from the B family, say B1, threatens D1, and then they separate without a reconciliatory grunt. We follow D1, And after several minutes, we hide a loudspeaker in the bush, and we play B1's grunt, as if reconciliation has occurred. And then we follow D1 to see if this changes D1's behavior. The control for this experiment is that you wait for the separation, and then instead of playing B1's grunt, you play A1's grunt, another individual who's high-ranking from another family who wasn't previously involved. And it turns out that the grunt makes a difference. After hearing a reconciliatory grunt, D1 approaches B1 and is more likely to tolerate B1's approach if B1 approaches. But it gets more baroque and complicated than that, because some of the times, if you get, say, a member of the B family, B1 attacks D1, then another member of the B family, B1's mother or sister, comes over and gives a reconciliatory grunt, as if to reconcile on behalf of her sister or mother by proxy. And so this seemed extremely interesting. So we, again, tried to test it by a field experiment. So we waited until B1 threatens D1, and then we played B2's grunt, the grunt of the original antagonist's sister or mother. And then we followed out to see how this affected behavior. And again, it affected D1's approach. D1 was more likely to approach B1 and B2, or to tolerate their approach if they approached them. Now, when you think about it, imagine what's got to be going through D1's mind in order to explain this behavior. D1 has to recognize that that's a grunt, that it's B2's grunt, that B2 is a close relative of the animal I just had to fight with, and so somehow there is a binding between this reconciliatory grunt and the prior event that took place. That means that B2's grunt has to do with the prior event, whereas A1's grunt doesn't have to do with that. So if we want to answer the question, what causes baboons to grunt and what do the grunts mean, we have to add another context and say that grunts from a recent rival or the rival's kin signal reconciliation. So what can we say so far? Well, first of all, we can say that despite their striking differences, language and baboon communication share many social functions. They help establish and maintain cooperative relationships between individuals, and these similar functional explanations help explain why there are these many homologous mechanisms for perception and recognition of different individuals. We can also conclude that context is an important determinant of meaning. Grunts by themselves are vague, imprecise signals whose meaning becomes more precise when they're embedded in a rich social context. And by context, I don't mean just the immediate events right there as the event is taking place. Context also means your memory of past interaction. What happened recently? What happened last week? It also draws on your knowledge of the structure of the group, the identity of individuals, who's related to whom, who's dominant to whom, so on. So context is an enormously rich, powerful addition specifying the meaning of these vocalizations. So given the baboon's social organization and structure organized around rank and kinship, a logical question that we asked was, well, this is fine. This is the way humans see baboon society. Is there any evidence that baboons recognize these relationships themselves? And the reconciliation experiments already give some indication that baboons do recognize this. But we've done a lot of experiments on showing that baboons and other monkeys recognize other individuals' close associates, in this case, matrilineal kin. So, say, female B1 recognizes the close bond between D1 and D2. This is interesting because it means that the animals are being skillful voyeurs and they're watching other individuals interact and making the appropriate deduction. In the case of dominance rank, of course, if you deal with an animal in the middle of the hierarchy, you don't want to just know that that animal treats those individuals higher ranking and those lower ranking. What you really want to know is if the individual can step outside of itself and recognize that number 3 outranks number 4 and number 6 outranks number 7. And you can test this by doing a sort of violation of expectation experiments in which you can play a threat grunt from a dominant individual and a scream from a subordinate individual. And if you do that, you don't get much response, because that sort of thing happens all the time in baboon society. But if you swap the vocalizations and play a threat grunt from a subordinate individual and a scream from a dominant individual, that gets a very strong response. It's a violation of expectation and suggests that the animals know the rank relations among others. And again, this is knowledge that can only be obtained by watching up others and making the appropriate deduction. And it also turns out that baboons seem to integrate their knowledge of these matrilineal kin ranks and their knowledge of dominance hierarchy so that they recognize that the linear dominance hierarchy can be subdivided into matrilineal kin groups. And you can do that by 2 different rank reversal experiments. If, for example, you play an individual, in this case, 2 members of the B family switching ranks, so number 4 outranks number 3, 4 threatens and 3 screams, well, that signals maybe a change in their relationship, but nothing that's particularly monumental. But if you do that across family boundaries, so you play playback that indicates that number 3 outranks number 2 and 2 screams, well, that signals a major upheaval, and the baboons respond much more strongly because it suggests that the entire B family is going to rise in rank above the entire A family. So this is interesting because we ask the question, what does it mean to recognize an individual in a group of baboons? For baboons, the recognition of an individual includes recognition of that individual's place in society, its dominance rank, its membership in a close kin group, and its inclination to behave in particular ways toward specific other individuals. So the minute you can say that an animal is a member of this particular family with this particular dominance rank, you can also predict how that individual is likely to be behave toward any particular other individual in the group. Again, baboons are good voyeurs, but it means that the mental representation of an individual's identity is incredibly rich and includes a lot more than just the recognition of that individual's identity. And it turns out that this makes a big difference in the life of primates. For example, in chimpanzees, where males compete for mates, high-ranking males do better than low-ranking males. But the males who do the best are the males who have a high betweenness in the jargon of this network analysis. That is, males do best if they are both high-ranking and they form alliances with other males who themselves don't form alliances with many others. And so that's a really interesting thing because it suggests that it is adaptive for you to monitor the behavior and alliance of other males. For females, it's interestingly different. Females who have the highest reproductive success are females that have the tightest, closest bonds with other females. But the ones who do really well are the ones whose closest bonds occur with other females who themselves have the most friends. So for females, it helps to go after the socially connected individuals. So this raises a number of sort of unresolved issues in the nature of the representation that these animals have. First of all, it has to do with learning. So from a simple stimulus, you hear another animal's vocalization. The listeners generate a complex representation. They place that individual in this rich social context based on kinship and rank. How do they do this? Obviously, they've got to learn to do this because you're born into a group. You can't be genetically programmed to interact with Sylvia and Helen and the members of that group. You've got to learn the individuals in your group. But how do they do this learning? Is it simply rote learning? Are you born into a group of baboons and you've just got to memorize the voices, the identity, the rank, and the kin group of every single individual? Or think of how much easier it would be if you went into it with a kind of social template. If you had a mental representation that essentially, speaking anthropomorphically, said, okay, I'm looking for the high-ranking families, and I'm looking for the males that are ranked in the linear order. You'd have an enormous advantage. Do they have such a social template? I have no idea. Is the baboon social template, if they've got it, the same for all primates? What about gorillas? Gorillas live in a society where there's one male and a number of females whose ranks are really not all that different. That suggests that maybe gorillas are born with a social template that's very different from the baboon social template. But in any case, we can say that natural selection is certainly going to give an advantage to individuals who have such a social template. Think about the males that have to go into a new group, and they've got to battle their way up the male hierarchy, and one of the ways to do that is to make friends with females. You could do that by rote learning of all the individuals in your new group, but what if the male went in thinking, as it were, matrilineal kin groups, male linear hierarchy? He would have an enormous advantage. Another unresolved issue is the issue of meaning, what a vocalization means to a baboon. If meaning is the result of the call plus the context, well, the auditory perception problem is not that big a deal. There are very few call types. They're easy to distinguish, so distinguishing the calls is not a particular problem. But context has an infinite variety of forms. There's an infinite number of possibilities of contextual features that could help you deduce the meaning of the signal. How do you decide which features are relevant, and how do you decide which are irrelevant and you can ignore? It's very much like the problem that tiny babies have when they start hearing words, nouns and verbs. They've got to use the contextual cues in which these nouns and verbs are embedded to figure out what they actually mean. But the context in that case is also, at least theoretically, infinite. Here are a couple of other speculations, and they're, first of all, about the way we study and consider the evolution of theory of mind. The first thing to say is that non-human primates never encounter strangers. They interact all the time, every day, repeatedly, over and over for 15, 20, or 25 years. There are really no strangers in primates' life. And what that means is, and then when you consider that that's the case, and you consider also that an individual knowledge of other individuals includes expectations of how they will behave toward every individual in the group, then your recognition of individuals essentially involves your recognition of each individual's intentions toward others. And that means, in turn, that your recognition of individuals includes a very rudimentary form of theory of mind, because you're attributing to others, you're predicting what kind of interaction they will have with every other individual. This is really different from the way we test theory of mind in humans and in human children, because in most of the human theory of mind experiments, you create these elegant experiments in which the individuals involved don't know each other. They're strangers. And that's exactly the kind of experiment you should do, because you want to know whether humans attribute theory of mind to someone that they've never seen before, they don't have any expectations before. So that's perfectly okay. But if we want to understand the evolution of a theory of mind, we have to place it in the context of millions of years of primates living in these same groups with the same individuals, interacting day after day after day. I mean, imagine imagine how boring this is going to be, because you've already seen all these individuals. You know all about them. And part of that knowing about them includes having an expectation of how they will behave toward others. Now, the idea that theory of mind is really kind of, in a rudimentary form, ubiquitous among non-human primates is at variance what most primatologists think these days. We're really interested in whether or not chimps do it or not, and the general view is kind of negative. But I would argue that it's a little bit different, that there's a case to be made for the notion that in these kinds of primate groups where individuals interact in these ways, theory of mind of a rudimentary sort is ubiquitous. The second point I want to make is that, again, remembering that there's constant social demands made on primates. And throughout the primate evolutionary history, every day they wake up and they have to deal with all the individuals and their behavior, which changes all the time. And this is essentially something that is inescapable and never ending. Well, if you now look at the recent sort of human neurophysiological stuff and you consider that the default mode network, so the brain when it's at rest, overlap a lot with what people call the mentalizing network. And I'm just sort of beginning to learn about this, but this is extremely intriguing because, to me, watching these baboons for so many years, this is obvious. The default mode network and the mentalizing network are one and the same because for millions of years, our primate ancestors had to mentalize every day, all the time. Mentalizing is the default condition for monkeys and apes. And that probably says something about the evolutionary history of mentalizing in humans. Finally, one last point that I want to make. I said at the beginning that non-human primates rarely take their different vocalizations and combine them into strings. And that's true, although there's some really interesting work being done that suggests that that may be more common than we had previously thought. But let's consider these vocalizations because although a single primate doesn't combine vocalizations to make a string of calls, primates hear vocalizations in strings all the time. They hear it whenever two individuals interact with each other, and they have to parse what that means. So imagine you're walking through the baboons, and all of a sudden, fortunately, you have your recording equipment turned on. Right in front of you, two animals get involved in a fight, and one of them gives threat grunts, and the other gives screams. So here's a picture of Sylvia, high-ranking female, giving threat grunts. These are soft, sort of breathy calls. And Hannah, a middle-ranking female, screaming. How does the listener interpret this particular string of vocalizations? It's just an auditory string. Well, the first thing you can say is that each element in this string has its own meaning. I mean, these threat grunts are demonstrably threat grunts. They're clearly Sylvia's threat grunts, and we know that because if we alter who's giving the threat grunts, or we alter the kind of vocalization that's given, things change. Ditto with Hannah's screams. It's clearly Hannah, and she's screaming. But how does the listener parse this stream? Well, the listener treats it as Sylvia is threatening Hannah, and this is causing Hannah to scream. The listener treats it as a kind of narrative account of who's doing what to whom. And it's a causal narrative. There's the element of causality, because if the listener thought that these two vocalizations came together just by chance, Sylvia's threatening somebody over there, and Hannah's screaming to something over there, then reversing the identities of the vocalizers would make no difference. But the reversing of the identity of vocalizers does make a difference, and it can only be, that result can only be explained if the listener assumes that Sylvia is threatening Hannah and Sylvia's threat are causing Hannah to scream. So how can we conclude all this? Well, when they hear vocalizations, baboons form a mental representation of what the call means. This is done instantly, and it's done very quickly. It seems to be a characteristic property of the baboon's mind. The representation of meaning is based on a number of discrete properties: the type of call, the caller's identity, the caller's kinship relations, the caller's rank, and these discrete properties are combined according to a set of rules. You don't give threat grunts to higher-ranking animals, you do give screams to higher-ranking animals, and so on. So this is a discrete combinatorial system. It produces a communication system that is governed by rules. You give certain calls to higher ranking, some to lower ranking. It's open-ended. New males come into the group and you learn their identities. Infants are born into families, and the minute an infant is born into a high-ranking family, it's treated like a member of that high-ranking family, and so on. And animals comprehend a huge number of messages from a relatively finite number of signals. If you're in a baboon and you can tell the difference between A threatens B and B screams on the one hand, and B threatens A and A screams on the other hand, and you can do that with every single pair in all the groups of individuals, all 60 individuals in the group, and you can incorporate new individuals that come in, either males emigrating or infants being born, then you've got essentially an open system that has unlimited possibilities. And also it's a system that incorporates causality. So one argument that you could make is that this kind of social knowledge is a kind of bootstrapping mechanism in the cognitive sense to language, that primate communication and cognition constitute a rich system of social knowledge in which meaning is embedded in context, a simple repertoire functions in a complex society, and I haven't said anything, there isn't anything to say really about semantics and syntax. So we might speculate that as a language evolved from a pre-linguistic communication system, several of its distinctive cognitive features were already present. All this discrete combinatorial aspects, the openness, and so on. So semantics and syntax, one could argue, were built upon a foundation of rich social knowledge. Complex, sort of pragmatic information from social knowledge is ubiquitous in primates. Syntax and semantics are rare. And so that right away is a prima facie case for the fact that social knowledge came first and semantics and syntax were built upon it. This is by no means an original idea. People have been saying this sort of thing, or approximation to it, for a while. Pinker and Bloom said grammar exploited mechanisms originally used for conceptualization, and Neumeier said the conditions for the subsequent development of language were set by the evolution of conceptual structure linked to individual vocalizations. David Premack, notorious for his emigrammatic remarks, said, language maps the knowledge the brain already has. And as in so many things, he was pretty insightful. And James Herford says, mental scene descriptions are necessary for practical tasks of primates, and they pre-exist language phylogenetically. That's also reasonable. So this is not an original idea. But there have been various candidates offered up as cognitive precursors to language, 3 in particular. The first is number. Liz Brannon and others have shown in elegant experiments that many primates have a very good conception of numerosity. There's beautiful work on orientation and navigation, also a discrete combinatorial system that shows that birds and many other animals combine discrete elements to deduce crucial information. And then there's the social cognition. What makes social cognition special? Well, there are a couple of things that give, to me, social cognition an edge in this particular argument. First, only in social cognition are the elements of the signaling tied to vocalizations. So what you've got is a meld between communication and cognition. They go together. And this is exactly what we would expect if we were looking for some kind of precursor to language. And only in social cognition are elements living creatures. Of course, they aren't in number system and navigation, but because they're living creatures, we attribute motives to them, intentions to them. So communication here is tightly linked to theory of mind and the attribution of intentions to others. So that would be the argument in favor of social cognition over number and orientation as a precursor to language. So to summarize, we study primates because they offer an approximation of thought and communication before language. Communication and cognition have always been embedded in social behavior, social relationships, social categories, and memories of past events. Before language, we can speculate, social cognition was ubiquitous, but semantics and syntax were rare. So there were concepts without words, computations without syntax, attribution of intent with only a limited theory of mind, mental scene descriptions, and in all of these cases, comprehension preceded production, as it does in young children. So in the reasoning that underlies social cognition, a kind of language of thought, we find precursors of semantics and syntax, and this might make the earliest stages of the transition from a communication system that is non-linguistic to one that is beginning to be linguistic. It may make this transition a little bit easier to understand. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Yes.
When you were hanging out with the baboons, did you have any sense they were factoring you into their social picture, and how did you rank?
If you came out and watched baboons with us, we would give you a little tutorial, because you've got to learn to be completely invisible to the baboons, which means that they would come up and they would see you as a strange individual, and at that point you look at your watch, you look up in the sky, something to make yourself boring. And we work very hard to do that and to avoid interfering in this. Yes, so that's, I mean, there are a few other examples of the vocalizations that, say, vervet monkeys give when they give vocalizations to a snake and vocalizations to a member of another group who they have territorial battles with. And that same vocalization, if you come upon a vervet suddenly and they threaten you, that's the vocalization they give you. So you're foreign. Yes?
Thank you. This was fascinating. I found myself very curious about the context of in which these grunt-based communication acts take place. And one thing that really struck me that you said was that, well, actually, there's less of this between members of the same family, as if they don't really need it. And I'm wondering whether, so in human language, there are when what would be uttered is highly predictable. There are a lot of consequences of that. It's reduced. It's often omitted entirely. And I'm wondering whether should we think of these the communicative acts as fundamentally guiding coordination of action among baboons? And do you see that, for example, when it's are baboons that have a very different rank, are they more likely to be able to interact without much interaction because it's obvious to that, without much communication because it's obvious who outranks who and what they should do, and the more communication comes out when the ranks are closer? Or how should we think about the role of these communicative acts in terms of the actions that the individuals are taking with each other?
So one of the dominant views about interpreting these kinds of vocal signals among animals is that whenever two animals come together, there is uncertainty about the outcome, because the best thing for A to do depends on what B does, and vice versa. And that grunts, being predictably linked to subsequent behavior, offer a way to resolve this uncertainty, because they do accurately predict that. If they didn't, then animals would cease responding to them. And so the idea is that grunts reduce uncertainty, they facilitate social behavior. And then when it comes to mothers and their daughters, or sisters as well, everything is pretty certain with them. They know what's going to happen. They don't need the grunts to resolve uncertainty. So that's admittedly post hoc, but that's an explanation for why the animals who interact most often grunt to each other least often. And it all has to do with the what is called the honest signaling hypothesis, that signals that honestly provide information for others and facilitate social behavior, those signals are going to be responded to appropriately. They're going to work. Yes, Jesse.
So the project, as I understand it, is that you go out and you look at baboon social structure and its complexity, and then you try to determine the degree to which the baboons themselves are representing the same kinds of structural things that you find. And so I guess I'm asking about another form of structure that logically seems like it might be there, right? So in actuality, families are hierarchical because there are multiple generations. And I know that primates, unlike us, or other primates unlike us, don't have post-reproductive periods. But if I got the age right, it looks to me like baboons could have grandchildren around, right? So what happens to those families then? If all of your kin take the ranks underneath you, what happens as that expands, and what happens when the matriarch dies? And could that be used as a way of looking at these systems?
So in most cases, the answer is you don't get much beyond 3 generations, if that, because the animals die, But you do get 3 generations, and in some places, like on the Cayo Santiago, the island off the coast of Puerto Rico, you get 3 or 4 generations, which raise at the moment, from the small sample we've got, as far as we can do, as the family expands, the behavioral ties between the individuals that make up these families begin to diminish, simply because of numbers. And so consequently, this branch of the family moves over here, and this branch of the family moves over there. But we just don't have a big enough sample size to answer that definitively. One of the things that I want to mention, though, now that you talk about these 3 generations, is an interesting question is how rich is the representation that animals have of the relationships that exist among others, and how abstract can it be? So I'll repeat some things that you and I talked about. For example, if there are 3 generations of a family, does an outside observer recognize that the relationship grandmother to daughter is in some respects similar to the relation daughter to granddaughter? That they're both mother-offspring? Do they have an abstract notion of this? There was one experiment where a Swiss scientist working with a large captive colony showed individuals pictures of mothers and their daughters, juvenile daughters. And she did this with 2 pictures in front: mother, juvenile daughter; female, not a juvenile daughter. And she rewarded the subjects for touching the picture that showed the mother and daughter. And then with a completely different set of photographs, all from familiar individuals, she tested her. She got all, perfect correct. So they do possibly seem to have a notion that transcends the generations, that recognizes the similarity, that perhaps has some sort of abstract notion of what kind of relationship it is. It's just an interesting question. Yes?
Do young baboons make mistakes with respect to communication in the hierarchy, and how is that corrected?
That's a really interesting question, and we don't know that much about it because we haven't followed these young baboons in as much detail. We have seen a juvenile try to recruit an older male against his sister. and which is clearly a mistake. And he wasn't punished, but it didn't work. And so that's a really interesting question. Josh?
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating talk. I have a very basic question. It's maybe related to something Roger was asking too. Since I just don't know that much about the lives of baboons, can you say more about like what they're communicating about and what they're actually acting about? Like when they're aggressive, what might happen? Like, is it like a dominant female might come in and threaten the baby of a different female, or is it what are they trying to achieve in the world that the social network is relevant for, that the language then helps to navigate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when they give vocalizations, often the vocalizations are used to facilitate social behavior, to make friendly behavior more more likely, grooming, that sort of thing, tolerance at a food site. When they interpret the vocalization of others, they all of a sudden have this incredibly rich representation of what's going on. So in a way, there's an asymmetry to your questions. The answer to the question, what are they communicating for? The answer is pretty simple. They want to facilitate social interactions. They want to be nice to their relatives. They want to get in with the high-ranking families. That's the goal. What information do they extract from the communication of others? All of a sudden, you uncover an enormous amount of knowledge about individuals. So it's kind of asymmetrical, and that's another thing that makes it quite different from human communication. Yes?
Kenny? Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for the amazing talk. And I had a question about the reconciliation grunt experiment. So you, when you play this recording, you end up creating a situation where one side in the fight thinks that it's, they've reconciled and the other one doesn't. So did you observe any kind of, surprising behaviors in that case? And if yes, did they, adjust their kind of thinking about those grunts, like, oh, B is just so inconsecutive, I'm not trusting her grunts again, or something like that?
Yeah, and it's true. We created reconciliation where, in fact, the dominant animal did not intend to reconcile. We didn't see anything that looked like cognitive dissonance. But I should also say that we were creating an abnormal situation. And you can't do these experiments too often. So those reconciliation experiments took 2 years to do. Because if you do one on one day, you can't do another one with the same individuals the next day. You've just got to space it out, because intervening your different experiments, life returns to normal and everything goes back to what it was. But you're right, that's an interesting problem. Yes, Nancy.
I want to understand a little better your argument for why it is that it's social cognition in particular that's the foundation for language. And so you had this slide where you said, look, there's other rich conceptual things that animals think about, like number and navigation, and I forget the other one. And of course that's true. It seems to me one argument is just that social cognition is the most important thing. It's more important than any of that other stuff, and it's just the main thing that they think about, and so that's what is the foundation. Another possibility, non-exclusive, is that that's the main thing that you want to talk to other animals about. You don't need to tell them about all the other, that there's 3 of something, or that, where you're going next. Mm-hmm. And I think there are other possibilities. Can you just say a little bit more about exactly why you think social cognition is and one part of that question is, I guess with the vervets at least, they talk to each other about predators. That's a I guess it's social in that you're sharing the information, but the content of what you're sharing isn't itself social. So do these guys have that?
Yes, certainly the context. Yes, baboons are like vervets, only a little bit different because they're bigger. But
they have those specific predators.
No, they don't, because baboons, being much bigger, if they see leopards during the daytime, they fight them. If they see lions, they flee. If they see anything else, they fight it. Vervets are small, but so thinking about testing between the hypothesis that social knowledge is a precursor of language because, you know, it's the crucial thing, or because it's just the most important thing in their lives. Social knowledge draws on the most important thing in their lives. So you can't eliminate that. That's why, you know, for baboon, my guess is when we finally get around and you people have the wisdom to put baboons in a scanner, you will find that the default mode network for baboons and the mentalizing network for baboons is also there, because mentalizing is the most important thing. I mentioned the precursor to language because unlike other aspects of cognition that are important for non-human primates, social cognition, at least with baboons and others, has these discrete elements that are combined and added together. And people often talk about that as something that is unusual about language and that doesn't exist anywhere else. So that's meant to sort of say, well, actually, no, there are aspects that are discretely combinatorial in the lives of non-human primates. That's what I would do. Because one of the arguments for number and for navigation has been that they are discrete combinatorial systems, and they are. But they're discrete combinatorial systems dealing with inanimate things. Yes?
Yeah, mine's like a more general question, but perhaps related to that. Is it the case that the vocal repertoire increases as social interactions become more complex? I'm talking about across different non-human primate species.
The people have tested the hypothesis that the vocal repertoire in some species is larger than it is in others, and I don't agree with that work, because it seems to me that the size of a species' vocal repertoire largely determines how closely and imaginatively it's been studied by humans, not by anything else. The interesting thing about chimps is that chimp brains are way bigger than the brains of baboons, and yet their vocal communication, we can't pinpoint for sure aspects of their vocal communication that is way different from that of monkeys and apes. Yes?
Okay, this is a pen question, which means it's not a question at all, right? I want to take your idea, your hypothesis about the relationship between language and social cognition and reframe it and see if you still agree with it or if you think I've missed something very big here, right? So let's throw away the word language, because everyone uses the word language in different ways. And let's say, is this an argument that the system for representing social cognition is a precursor to the conceptual system that external linguistic forms map onto, right? That seems to me the hypothesis you have the best evidence for. When you look at the actual communicative forms, right, what's being communicated, they're not actually mapping onto this rich social cognitive representation at all. In fact, you really highlighted the ways in which they kind of slide past it. So this seems to be showing that inside my head, when I conceptualize this, right, I have something that is combinatorial, that has something roughly like predicates and arguments, right, that combine in interesting ways and into causal structures. Now, I think if I interpret what you're saying that way, I think what you're saying is there a good reason to think that the conceptual system that I use to represent other people's social intentions is systematically more likely to be the one that language maps onto, right? And you're saying one piece of evidence you have from there is because it's discrete and combinatorial. I mean, I think I might push that to the side, because I suspect that most of us in this room believe that all descriptions at the cognitive level for many things are going to be discrete and combinatorial, but we can put that aside. But one other feature it has, right, is that to represent other people's mental states, I have to be able to represent a very rich set of contents. It has to have that kind of domain generality to it, right? It is social in a sense, but it has to represent all the things they can think about or all the things that can be motivations.
Yeah, I agree with that formulation, because the cognitive apparatus that the baboons bring to bear when interpreting these signals is much more elaborate than the communicative apparatus, their signals. So what I guess I could try and draw an analogy that if you think about, say, the evolution of bipedalism, that skeletal morphologists look at chimps knuckle walking or quadrupedalism, and they say, okay, it's not bipedalism, but notice how just a minor shift in this structure can make a big difference in terms of the evolution of bipedal locomotion. Some of the cognitive operations that we think of as being intimately involved in language are already going on there. So the idea that when you start applying them more to the actual communicative signals, some of the operations are already there. Now, this is of course hand waving on my part, but it's not irrelevant if you're trying to say that, you know, it's not a black and white distinction. We don't need a sort of saltative jump. Am I getting you?
Yeah, so you're agreeing this is largely about the conceptual representations that language builds upon and their structuredness.
Yes, because if you're going to understand, if you're going to think that a vocalization identifies a concept, it surely helps if you've already got concepts already. Your concepts may not be concepts about vocalizations, but they're concepts nonetheless the same. And so that is a leg up. It's a sort of conceptual, it's sort of cognitive leg up in that. Yes?
That was amazing talk. I was kind of wondering about, so the current results seems to suggest that this vocal cause can facilitate social coordination, but can they change hierarchies between individuals? Let's say, do baboons negotiate with each other about who's ranked higher?
That really happens with the males, and I haven't talked about the males very much, but a new male comes into the group, and whereas the female hierarchy seems to be quite stable for many, many, many years, the male hierarchy changes usually 1 or 2 rank changes every couple of weeks. And when these rank changes happen, males that are involved in an unstable rank relation do a lot of vocalizing to each other as they pass each other. There's a lot of displays. There are a lot of these vocalizations that follow the same general notion I mentioned earlier. The vocalization is meant to challenge and predict.
So these vocals are strategically used to kind of establish their roles in that house?
Yes. Yeah, to try to decide what the balance is between attack and retreat, for example. Yes?
Interesting, the development of this recognition of the social meanings. Do you know how long does it take for the baboons to develop this, and what's critical for the development of this? Like, will more social interactions make them earlier at learning this, or like other factors?
We don't know how long it takes. And when I was talking about, you know, what is the nature of the mental representation that an infant is born with when it first arrives in the group? Well, we just don't know. Is it sort of vague and inchoate and it has to learn this? But surely it's learned it by the time it's 6 or 8 months old. And it's certainly learned something about its own particular rank. Now I've forgotten the second half of your question.
What's the critical?
Is there a critical period? I have no idea. You know, I mean, that would be really interesting. And yes, yeah, that would be really interesting.
Maybe I'll take my hosting privilege to ask the last question, and then we can go to the reception. So you spent many years thinking about animal communication and human language. So what is it, do you think, that pushed language into place? Like, what wasn't enough at some point with this very limited number of communicative signals? Like, what made it so that we needed to say more or to understand more, to exchange more or something? Like, what's your take? I mean, just speculate well.
I mean, it is a real problem because we have, as we follow these animals around, we can think of many cases in which they need a new vocalization, a vocalization that signals such and such, and it's not there. And so what is it that's going on? It seems like natural selection, I mean, let's be extreme adaptationists for the moment, as let's assume that natural selection is pushing animals to develop the most adaptive system of social interaction that they can develop. And somehow it's encountering resistance when it tries to select for better phonology, a larger vocal repertoire, etc. It's not encountering resistance when it comes to cognitive operations. That, you know, in many respects, you could talk to a sophisticated animal learning person like Bob Rescorla, and he would say, yeah, that sounds about right. So what they're doing is their selection is taking the path of least resistance. It's selecting for sophisticated intelligence without a large vocal repertoire. What makes it push for a large vocal repertoire? I don't know, you know, that's the target of hypotheses. And notice that when Svante Pabo talks about FOXP2, he says quite rightly, a mutation in FOXP2 would only be effective if it occurred within the context of an already very sophisticated system of communication. So I have not answered your question. I've only sort of waffled on, but...
That's great. Thank you very much. Let's thank Robert.